Okay, so I think we'll get going. Welcome everybody to the third conversation in our third COVID-19 conversation series. And it's titled Recovery and Regeneration in the Face of Overlapping Crises. And today, as part 3 of that third conversation, the theme is recognizing power. And we have some outstanding guests on our panel with us today. I'm Claire Betker. I'm the Scientific Director at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health, and I will host the conversation today. The NCCDH, as we call it, is located in Mi'kmaq, which is the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The center is hosted by St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, beautiful Antigonish, Nova Scotia. I work and live in Treaty 1 territory, which is the original land of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dakota, and the Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, which is Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I've been there back home since the pandemic. The National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health is one of 6 collaborating centers, or one of 6 knowledge translation centers that are funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And you can see them there. Ours is in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. The National Collaborating Center for Health and Public Policy is in Quebec. The National Collaborating Center for Methods and Tools, hosted by McMaster University, is in Hamilton, Ontario. National Collaborating Center for Infectious Diseases, is hosted by the University of Manitoba, also in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health, hosted by BC CDC in British Columbia. And the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health, which is hosted by the University of Northern BC, also in British Columbia. And we were all put in place by the Public Health Agency of Canada post-SARS. So we've been in place now for more than 15, 16 years, and have been really active I think, in Canada's response to COVID-19. Our focus at our center, the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health, is on the structural and the social determinants of health, with a very sharp focus on health equity and health inequity. We have a great team at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health, and a big shout out and thanks to Midian Richard and Tia Mata for their leadership and support to this series. And we've got a number of other members of our NCCDH team with us, and you'll meet them in our small group breakout in about an hour. So why this series? So why are we doing this, and why have we come together? So in this third series, I said that it's the third series, and the first one we did it very early in the pandemic, actually, I think in the first couple of months in April, really looked at the planning and response. A year later, we had the second series, and we looked at continued response, and building on Teresa Tam's report, Dr. Teresa Tam's report on taking an equity approach to the COVID-19 pandemic and the COVID-19 response. So in this one, in this conversation series, we're really looking at listening, at leading, at recognizing systems of power, and fostering courage and hope for an equitable, regenerative public health system or systems as we move forward. And we hope that through these conversations together, we'll start to create space for collective healing and collective recovery. And we've felt that and seen that in the first 2 conversations, and we hope that you'll join us in that collective thinking and feeling and conversation today. So our intention is to create a space where we can listen, where we can share, where we can connect, and we really want to hear from you. On this particular conversation series today, on your registration, there were an enormous amount of questions and ideas that were given to us. So please use that chat box to communicate with us and to ask us questions. And I think they've put it in the chat box already, but I just want to remind you out loud that we do have simultaneous interpretation going on right now. And if you look or cast your eye down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the word interpretation or that globe. If you click on that, you can pick the language that you would like to be listening in. And that, that interpretation will be available to the audience for the whole session today, the conversation today. Also, in terms of the bottom of the screen, there's the box there with chat in it, and I can see there's already 16 responses in there, but I would encourage you to introduce yourself in there, say where you're from, provide a land acknowledgement if you so choose, and be thinking about what are the questions that you might like to have answered, or what are some of your comments that you'd like to contribute into the conversation as we move along. There'll also be a link to an evaluation that'll come out right after the webinar where you can offer your feedback, your comments, and your ideas for future conversations, and of course where we can improve. We're wide open to your feedback and welcome it. So you'll see that come after the webinar. So our theme today is recognizing power. And you can see on the slide, there's some of the topics that we had heard about in the other conversation series that we're thinking about as a team and as a center were around how does power influence or frame or direct our collective public health efforts, whether we're at a point of care in a local health unit or whether we're at a senior decision-making table or leadership position, a more formal leadership position within a regional health authority, a provincial health system, or perhaps nationally. What are the shapes that power can take? And how do we recognize our own power, the power of our systems and our teams and our organization? Where's the power of the community? How can we help or how can we support, or how can we open space for that power to be expressed, for that power to be used? And then one concept that comes up often when you're talking about power is that notion of accountability, or that core value, actually, both at an individual level, but also an organizational level of accountability. So the team from the NCCDH will be adding resources to the chat box as we go along, as well as sharing other comments. If you've got a story that you would like us to follow up with you on, also add that to the chat box and maybe leave your contact information so we can do that. So who's with us today? As you can see, there's 90 participants on. Many of you are working in local public health, whether it's at a provincial, regional health authority level, health unit level, or in research, teaching, and in the academy. About half of you are from Ontario, and that's pretty typical in our attendance at our webinars, so that about 50% of those who attend are from Ontario, and we welcome you. But today we have nearly 10% that registered are joining from outside Canada. So we have an international speaker group, but we also have an international audience. So from the US, from the UK, from Europe and Africa. We have today a few more researchers and than we've had in the past, and so we welcome them. So welcome to all. So we built into our session a chance to hear from you, as I said, and to discuss what you're hearing. And right after our panel, which will end at the top of the hour, we're going to go into breakout groups where our staff will be with you, our speakers, two of them at least will be with you. And it's a chance for you to talk to each other and to us about what you've heard and what you're thinking about. And they've been really well received and actually really well evaluated. So if you can stay with us, we'll go into those breakout rooms for about 20 minutes at the top of the hour. Okay, so we have three guests with us today. And they come from diverse backgrounds and diverse settings. So I think we're set up for a really good conversation. And we're going to talk about their perspectives. And I'm going to start by inviting them to give us their perspective on power and how it manifests itself both in their work, but also in what they see in the multiple systems and the multiple levels around them. Individually and together, they'll break down the elements of power and power imbalances. And they'll explore how the outcomes of structural inequities manifest in particular populations do directly as a result of power imbalances. And they'll address how power affects health. What's that relationship between power and power balance and health of individuals, communities, and populations? So, for example, the influence of corporate power on public health. And they'll also reflect on the power of community and community organizing. So just a really quick reminder that I said this is the third in a 5-part series. And for those of you that may not be able to stay with us for the breakout groups and have to leave at the top of the hour, we're really hoping that you'll join us for the final 2 conversations in this 5-part series. And they're on June 11th, where we'll explore discovering courage, and then on June 22nd on finding hope. And both of those are Wednesdays and both at 12 noon Eastern time for those of you who can join. Okay, so I'm going to proceed now to our questions, and I'm going to introduce each of our speakers just a little bit before I ask them to speak. So once the one speaker speaks, then I'll come back and introduce the next one. And I kind of gave them the cue here. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Jonathan Heller. Jonathan is a senior health equity fellow at the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. And he's also been acting as a consultant, a WISE advisor and a WISE consultant to us at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health over the past year, and is continuing with us this year. Previously, he co-founded, directed, and then co-directed Human Impact Partners, a nonprofit organization in the US focused on bringing the power of public health to campaigns and social movements, all for a just society. Jonathan is also the co-founder and the past president of the Society of Practitioners of Health Impact Assessment, and serves on the board of an organization called Community Change. Okay, Tia, I think we're okay without the slides now, so we can see our people and see our speakers. So Jonathan, I'm going to introduce you, and then I'm going to ask you our first question. Or I already introduced you, so I'm going to ask you the first question. So Jonathan, why is recognizing and acting on, actually taking action on power important for public health, especially as we move into recovery and regeneration from an equity perspective and using an equity approach? And I just want to add that in the registration, many folks asked, so you recognize power, so you see that, but then so what? Now what? What do I do? So why is it important, Jonathan? Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire, for the introduction and for inviting me to be part of this and part of your work. I'm calling in today from Oakland, California, which is Ohlone land. Yeah, this question about power is important for us. Thinking about this pandemic, a lot of people are talking about going back to normal. We know that normal isn't really good enough, right? We know that a lot of people were not doing super well before the pandemic. We need to do better by everybody. It's very clear that the determinants of health have influenced outcomes during this pandemic. Things were inequitable before the pandemic, and that has led to terrible outcomes for many communities, especially people of color. And we don't want to go back to that. That's not good. That's not, normal isn't good enough. We want a just recovery. To do better, I think we need to recognize that it's not an accident that we have inequity, that it's not inevitable. Historically, inequities have benefited particular populations. They're intentional. For example, here in the US, white homeowners benefited a lot from inequities. And it's not just historic. People continue today to benefit from either maintaining past inequities or creating new ones. And whether that's shareholders at companies like Uber or Walmart, or housing developers who aren't being required to build affordable housing, those folks have power and they benefit from the inequity they gain financially and otherwise. So I would say that we need to both take power away from those folks and support those most impacted by inequity in building their power, and that is what will lead to more equitable systems and structures. Folks in public health, I would say, don't like to think about power very much. Or if they do think about power, they think about it as a bad thing, that it's about power over, it's about oppression, it's about exploitation. Its power is something that should be limited. But I really like a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that power is the ability to achieve purpose. Whether it is good or bad depends upon the purpose. And so if our purpose is advancing equity, health equity, racial equity, I would say our purpose is good and we need to focus on building power. So, we can think about power in many different ways. And it's not just about power over, it's about power to, it's about power with, it's about power within. We can think about the power to win a vote at a city council meeting that improves, for example, health or the determinants of health. We can think about the power to influence what's on that city council meeting's agenda. What are they voting on at the provincial level or at the federal level? That's a different form of power. It's creating an infrastructure to influence the decisions being made and the agendas being set. And we can also think about the power to influence the way people even think about the world. How prominent is individualism? What do we think about the role of government? What's the role of markets? People have these ideas about all these things that lead to certain policies kind of being inevitable, being the natural course, common sense. And many of those ideas are not ideas that lead to equity. So changing the way people even conceive of the world, their worldviews, is another form of power. And I just say that we already do a bunch of this work within public health, even though we don't necessarily think about it that way or recognize it. We already use some of our public health power. We write reports that inform decision makers, and we show up at city council meetings sometimes. We speak truth to power often, and that can influence a vote. We form coalitions and we support the building of infrastructure among the folks who are most impacted by inequity. That's another form of power. And we've been trying to move people from thinking about individual responsibility as the only determinant of health to thinking about a broad set of determinants of health over the last many years. And that, again, is another form of how we use power. But of course, we could do more. We could partner with community organizing groups to support their work and lift up the voice of those most impacted. We can help organizers win policy and structural change, helping others speak truth to power. We can do more to shift narratives like the biomedical model of health and personal choice. So there's a lot more we can do, building off of where we already are and going deeper into our understanding of power and having that guide our strategies and our actions.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's a great way to start our conversation. So I'm going to introduce Matthew Herder. Matthew, and then I'll come to Dr. Smita Prakali, and it'll be interesting because we're going to move from your perspective into a kind of a research perspective, and then Smita's in a community health center in Ottawa. So Matthew is the director of Dalhousie University's Health Law Institute, as well as an associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine with a cross appointment to the Schulich School of Law. In his research, Matthew uses critical legal analysis to study how laws and policies influence the development and regulation of, as well as access to, biomedical technology. So interesting segue from you, Jonathan. And Matthew, congratulations, is also one of 7 newly appointed Canadian Institute of Health Research, CIHR, applied public health chairs, and that funding is for 6 years. So I think we're going to see and hear from Matthew in public health over those next 5 or 6 years. So Matthew, then from your very different vantage point, although there is some real commonalities there, why is recognizing and acting on power important for public health, especially as we look into that recovery and regeneration post-pandemic, and really looking for an equity approach and an equity-driven set of actions. So over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, and thank you to the Centre and everyone for attending the invitation today. I'm joining from Halifax, as Claire said, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, known as Mi'kmaqi. We are all treaty people. I'll just put my cards on the table and say that I'm not, despite the theme of this, in a place of recovery. My work, as you alluded to, is around drug policy and its implications for public health, for equity. And I think despite some sort of remarkable feats in the course of the pandemic, I think the inequities that are in the world have been worsened through it, in particular in terms of access to things like vaccines and antivirals, which are so critical to recovery. So I'll just be open with everyone today and say that that work and that focus has left me not feeling like I'm ready for regeneration and lots more critique for the time being. I think this question of how to recognize it, and I know there was lots of feedback around, so there's power, what do we do? And that's obviously essential as well. But I think that starting part of the question around how do we recognize it and its implications is really critical, because if we don't sort of recognize it in its full scope and how it manifests in various ways and systems, whatever action we might take may be misguided or a half-hearted solution. And so I think there's actually a really important methodological question, not to get too academic in my language, but about how we actually observe power and how it manifests and what tools we use to try and figure that out and how it moves into these different spaces. Because one of the things that concerns me, at least on a conceptual level, is that I think a lot of us working in different dimensions of public health, healthcare, research, and so on, have a very good rough understanding or detailed understanding of how it's working in our particular field or organization, right? It's power is the people who have capital and influence, right? But we don't always see how that interconnects across systems and produces the outcomes that are so troubling, like the ones in the pandemic in terms of access to the health goods that we need. And so for me, a key thing is to actually think through, and this is perhaps a bit of a bias for my discipline in law, where I try to figure out how law, very broadly understood, not just the law in the books, but the practices that sort of follow in institutions from those laws, that connect political elites and a sort of prevailing economic order. There's this growing sort of area of scholarship called law and political economy, and it really sort of tries to map and understand law, again, very broadly understood as this kind of connective tissue that actually preserves power, right? The people who are powerful not because they've centered equity along the way. And there's a lot of resources that go into maintaining a particular order or way of doing things. And we saw that in the pandemic. So again, drawing from my own field, right? How do we get the vaccines that we need to recover and reemerge from this? Well, we rely on industry and we throw everything we can to develop those vaccines as fast as possible. We got some really great vaccines, but with that massive investment on the public sector side of the equation, and actually, frankly, a lot of science as well, not just funding, but the actual doing the work, we still decided, despite that huge level of support from a big part of the system, not to attach any kind of meaningful strings to ensure that we could make the products available in the parts of the world that need them, that don't necessarily have as much manufacturing capacity, for instance. So we've seen this sort of reproduction of the status quo, and that comes through a system in which people say the only way we get something is if we use as many market-based incentives like intellectual property rights, patents, and so on as possible. And any sort of testing or qualifying those rights threatens the level of innovation that we need. And so I think there's actually very little evidence to support that. But power is manifesting there in that it sort of prevents us from even asking those questions or stop, the efforts of over 100 countries to actually introduce some just time-limited qualifications to that way of producing innovation, so that some of these medicines can be available in parts of the world that don't have a lot of access right now. So I think that how question, as much as we want to get to the what do we do, we really have to take it on in full scope and have a deep understanding of what power is and how it's sort of baked into law, politics, the economy across the board. To move to the action question, I'll just say a few things because I think I'm already eating up most of my time. I think we have to act in a multiplicity of ways. So, and we have to act really strategically. I think, the interests that want to preserve the status quo move across a number of policy registers. And so to conceive the sort of challenge that lies as being within public health and not also intellectual property law or several other areas of policy is a mistake. We have to move across domains and use research, advocacy, and various forms of collaboration across all of them. And fundamentally, doing that, two last thoughts. One, as part of the research, part of what we have to do is actually surface the incredible contributions that the public sector and public health already makes. My favorite example actually comes from a government lab in Winnipeg, which pretty much developed the Ebola vaccine that was critical to dealing with the biggest Ebola outbreak in history in 1415 in West Africa. That was actually came to be controlled by a large multinational company, but all of the work, not just the discovery science, but the later stage stuff was done on the public sector side. So that runs as a counterpoint to this narrative that only the private sector can do this kind of stuff. And so surfacing those kinds of contributions that public health scientists and researchers make is incredibly important and part of the mix of strategies we should use. And on the process side, just to conclude, I think we have to, sort of work tirelessly to decenter the privileged perspective, the perspective of the expert. We've failed, frankly, in the policy domain that I'm working in terms of wealthy countries to actually act and be good global citizens. I don't think we have the fortitude, the will, or frankly, enough kind of caring for other parts of the world to assume that we're going to come up with the solutions to change outcomes in the future and future pandemics. So I think we have to decenter our own efforts and work to be allies with other folks doing really critical on the ground disruptive work in other parts of the world. I'll stop there. Sorry if I went on too long.
No, thank you, Matthew. And you really took us to, a very high level, but gave us some really interesting things to consider. So in the chat box, we've had a couple of people really kind of asking about the power of the people, if you will, and recognizing their agency. And that, Jonathan, you gave some very helpful prescriptive actions that maybe we could dig more deeply into in terms of community organizing and those kinds of things. So I want to introduce our third speaker because I think Smita has the experience and the thinking to sort of take us in that direction. So Dr. Smita Pakali is a clinician scientist at the Ottawa Hospital and the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. And she's been there since 2008, so has a long history of being in that clinician scientist research perspective. And she is leading community-based research projects at the Bridge Engagement Center that they call the Bridge, which is in Ottawa, Ontario. And through their research in true partnership with the people who have lived in living experience and self-identify as experiencing poverty, homelessness, and other structural and social determinants of health and health inequities. So Smita, from your perspective, sort of right there, boots on the ground, but also from the clinician and research perspective, why is recognizing and acting on power important for public health? And what are those strategies or mechanisms or actions that you found in collaboration with the people in the community that you work with as we move forward into the future? So over to you, Smita.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for this invitation. And I'm coming to you from Ottawa, like Claire said. We are sitting on a, Algonquin territory, and I always say we pay rent to the wrong owners. Here in Ottawa, like Claire said, we work in partnership with people coming from these populations who are Indigenous, low-income, racialized, or experiencing even homelessness, are our colleagues. So we try to bring down those power barriers to whatever length possible. Of course, at the end of the day, I always say, I'll always be the clinician, and that's my identity, but whatever power imbalances we could bring down. Because, we talked a little bit about identifying and recognizing the individual power, because we do all at the individual level have those seeds. And I always say, might have said in many interviews before, that when we treat humans like humans, the magic happens. And I really mean by that, because we see the living example of this. Because when we say all these concepts of power and privilege, and they're not nebulous concept, who has the power, which organization and which government and which company. These are, at the end of the day, individuals who are running those organizations and who are running those companies. These are the individuals. And when we go to that root of the root cause of these issues of power and privilege, it is the individual at the center of it. And when we go to that individual level, then the bare minimum requirements which surface, and a lot of times there is a tension, right? There is a tension, sometimes manifested even as hatred, between people at the individual level, the gender and sex and the race and caste and class. And then it gets manifested at the company level and the organizational level, at the national level. But it starts at the individual level. And that individual, also the same individual who is capable of hate, is also has the seeds of compassion, has the seeds of that loving kindness we talk about, or that sympathetic joy, which is the true joy for seeing that true participation of that person who could not have done that till yesterday. But because you believed in that individual capacity, you feel that sympathetic joy, that true joy. But it has to culminate into that equanimity. And the equanimity is the concept which started with the Buddha, is that even-headedness and that unbalance gone, or that tension gone, that hatred gone, and only based on the compassion. And the compassion is not care. We should not confuse compassion with care. Compassion is something way beyond that. And we all are capable of that. We have seeds of compassion. We have seeds of sympathetic joy. We do have seeds of loving kindness. And that's what will culminate in equanimity. And we see the living examples of all of these at the bridge when you believe in that true power of the person, when you treat humans like humans. And I really mean by that, when you treat humans like humans, the magic do happen. And people who literally from the street are our colleagues, they are the community peer researchers. They do the recruitment, consenting, they administer the surveys, they administer all the tests measurements related to the study. They are involved in knowledge mobilization. They are involved on our grant writing and on and on. And that power to that person, when we recognize and admire and give them that privilege to enact, you see the magic happening. And we need to recognize these seeds in each individual so that the change happens at the organizational level, the company level, the national level. And then only the change will happen if the change happens at the individual level. And I will stop there, Claire.
Thank you. Make sure I'm off of mute here. Yes, thank you, Smita. So when we treat humans like humans, the magic happens. I'll take that away from today and from you. Thank you for that and that equanimity. There's a question, I was looking at the chat box here. There's a question in the chat box that's asking if we could dig a little deeper into some of those actions. Can we dig into those more deeply? And a lot of those were community organizing principles. And Jonathan, you kind of introduced them there. So I'm going to come back to you and just, Jonathan, are there a couple of those really concrete actions that you talked about in your introductory remarks? And maybe you want to respond both to Matthew and Smita in some of your comments now, but how to really dig into that, those actions, especially those that are related to community organizing.
Yeah, good questions, and it's fun to hear Smita and Matthew, but what you have to say as well. I appreciate your viewpoints, and I think we share a lot. This idea of community organizing, I want to just be a little clearer about what I mean about that. It's, and what a community organizing group is. For me, there are many community organizations out there, but there are some that try to bring people who are basically impacted by inequities together and have them self-identify the problems that they face, have them build their skills and help them build their skills to be able to address those problems, and that's a form of power building, right? It's not somebody coming in from the outside with identifying the problem. It's listening to the people who are most impacted and helping them take action on those things. And that's what a community organizer does in my mind. And so for me, the link between some of what, Smita, you were saying about individuals and centering individuals, I agree that individuals have power, but not in every individual at this moment has equal power, right? If you think about the billionaires who own these companies, they buy votes, they make campaign contributions, they influence things in ways that many people cannot do, right? And many of us just don't have that kind of money or that kind of influence, that kind of power. So to me, the answer to that is people power. And that is what community organizing does. It brings community together, communities that are most impacted by inequity together to help them build their power. And so that's where the action comes in from a public health perspective, from in my opinion, is that we can support communities doing that organizing. We can change our own decision-making processes so that for decisions that we have control over, that are public health decisions, we can change what those look like and who's involved in making those decisions. We can, in those cases, maybe cede power or make decisions together with those communities. We certainly in public health bring expertise, and that has to be recognized as well. That's another form of power. But we need to bring in the community voice. But then in many cases, there are many things that we don't have control over within public health. And in those cases, we need to work with communities to support their power building and use our resources, whether it's our research or our ability to convene. The fact that public health is often viewed positively by many people, or at least it used to be in many places, and that works. And then Carolina has a question here. Can we speak to inside outside strategies? Absolutely, right. So there are things that public health can do. We have access to decision makers. We have our research. We can work from the inside to make change and partner with community organizing groups on the outside who can do things we can't do. They can do advocacy and lobbying that we might not be able to do. Each of us has a role, each of us has skills, and we can coordinate often behind the scenes, not necessarily in a public way, so that we're each bringing our skills and our abilities to bear on solving these problems, to building community power, shifting important structures and decisions.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank Caroline as one of our team from the NCCDH. Thanks for that, that question, Carolina. And you know, Sveta, to put you on the spot, when I think about some of the folks that I know in this country, when Jonathan talks like that, I think about you and I think about your work. So I'm wondering if you want to just respond to Jonathan from that perspective.
Thank you. No, you brought important point, Jonathan, but at the end of the day, even those billionaires or those CEOs of those multi-billion-dollar companies are individuals, and they also have the seed for compassion. And if they cultivate that seed for compassion and that true sympathetic joy, they would come to that conclusion of not wealth accumulation and not just donating 2 cents out of their billions of dollars. However, they would be those people who would be, acting with equanimity. And that individual power lies with similarly you and I and people who we work with at the bridge, but also at the helm of the power or the nation's capital or political power or capitalist power. They are also individuals. And unless that change happen at that individual level, that individual core values, it is not going to come out. We will keep blaming the company. We will keep blaming the governments. We will keep blaming the organizations. Who are they? They are not people. The people are acting. People are making decisions. People are accumulating wealth. And that individual level change has to happen. Then only change will happen. Otherwise not.
Thank you. Thanks, Smita. And so they are humans as well, is what you're saying. So at that human level. There's a question in the chat box about a story where actually there was a shift in power and where actually something changed as a result of action. And Matthew, I think you said you could speak to that. Is that true? So I'm going to go to you.
I'll try. So in the course of the pandemic, I was involved in some harm reduction related efforts for people in the local community who use drugs. And part of what they were concerned about was, how do we get access to things that we consume on a daily basis when physical distancing is in place, when we can't see our doctors? There were some policy changes that tried to facilitate that through verbal prescribing and so on. But it really, it shed light on the need for a safe supply of prescription grade drugs that many people who use drugs require. And so we started this project with folks in the community. They shaped the questions. We completely changed our methodology, which was going to be trying to, do a scoping review of what was in the literature. And we instead sort of did that alongside having an advisory council that actually completely unpacked the findings in the literature and criticized the approaches and so on. So we worked on it and tried to decenter our sort of training as academic researchers in light of the insights that the real experts, frankly, had. But in the course of trying to share our findings with decision makers and talk about what safe supply means in a broader range of concerns that the community was bringing to us in the course of the research, it devolved into a discussion with policymakers and other actual researchers about, well, shouldn't we really call it safer supply? Because these are, very powerful drugs that we're talking about. So it's not that they're risk-free. And through that moment in that discussion, the community folks, the people who use drugs, I think were completely alienated. And they're in, you know, this is a red herring, a sideshow. It had nothing to do with changing the outcomes. It had everything to do with making conservative prescribers more comfortable with the language. And so we had to, you know, think through not just our research process, but to make time and just talk to each other differently, to sort of riffing off of Smita's point about humans and human engagement and respect. And so it's really taking the time to understand how that had to filter through everything, literally the words we used, not just problematic ones, but technical ones, so that we could develop trust and really learn from the people whose needs we were trying to address in some way, or help address, I should say. So I don't know if that's a great example, but it's you know, the time that is required to do appropriate sort of allyship and work with community organizations is often something, you know, many people don't feel they have, but it's an absolute necessity.
Thanks for that example, Matthew. And I'm going to ask Smita and Jonathan to respond to that. Smita, do you want to add to or challenge what Matthew?
Yeah, no, exactly, Matthew. You said that, you know, the engagement and partnership with really people on the ground is, I always say, very time consuming and very labor intensive, but very, very rewarding. A lot of times I tell my ivory tower research colleagues that they do research, they analyze the data, and then they publish the paper, and that is their fruit. For me, when I am at the bridge and when people are there, we cook, we eat, that already is a reward. For me, every day is a reward, because when people are at the bridge, they are not here, there, or here, or not engaged in this, because a lot of people at the bridge, the police know them by first name. Mm-hmm. They are guilty before even they step out of their house. So people get into trouble just by standing on the wrong side of the wrong street without doing anything. And this is in the capital city of a rich country. On July 1st, my city needs to look clean, and police sweep happens. The police van comes and they just take you to the jail because you don't belong. And so when people are there at the bridge, it is already a reward, but it is very time consuming and very, very labor intensive. Engaging with people, the language matters. We go through a lot of sessions of word smithing, making sure people are not re-traumatized by just this academic lingo, because this is the preferred term over the other, you know. So we go through a lot of conversations at the bridge, and that's very, very time consuming and also very taxing for both the parties. And you have to be very sensitive when you are doing these discussions, because words matter, language matter. And that is very lived example, day-to-day reality for us at the bridge.
You want me to go, Claire, or should I see Matthew, you have your hand up. You want to respond to that?
Oh, no, I think that's just my iPad putting it up for me without me meaning to.
Oh, got it. Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, I also agree. This is really difficult, time-consuming work. It is also, to me, what we're meant to be doing. It's to me, this is, you know, the example you gave is basically an idea, the same idea. It's we're helping community build power by going through our processes, you know, engaging them in our processes and building their skills in that. So I think it's exactly the work we want to do. It is not short-term work. It's not a quick fix. I don't think there is a quick fix to this. And Claire, if you don't mind, I will also just want to respond, Smita, to your comment. Like, yes, I think that these people who are wealthy are absolutely individuals, and I hope, and if I were religious, I would pray that they do change, and that, you know, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk here in the States, Donald Trump, I want them to become better individuals. I'm not going to hold my breath and wait. I think part of our long-term work is building our collective power on the ground, you know, with, you know, this people power idea. That it doesn't have to be either or. We can work to make them to get them to change, And I think we, at the same time, we need to be trying to build, power in communities that are facing inequities, so that it's not just waiting for them to change, but it's actually doing things that actually shift systems while those individuals are hopefully changing.
Thanks, Jonathan. There's a really interesting question just came in from Victoria Barr here, and I'm just going to try to, and I'm going to ask you, Matthew, to start to respond to this one. And what she says is that power imbalances exist in most interactions at the micro level, as well as at the macro level, and we seem to be moving up and down those systems levels. So in every meeting, some people might have more power than others, and often related to underlying societal factors such as racism, sexism, classism. And those power differentials can shape who is able to speak, for how long, and about what. And one of the questions on, a couple of the questions actually on registration talked about advisory committees, or having community groups, and how public health in those community groups could actually ensure that voices are heard and that the power imbalances were addressed. So her question is, how do we enhance awareness in public health of these kinds of power imbalances that happen every day? And I'm going to say at every level. So Matthew, you've had some opportunity at a very high level, and then I'll go to, Smita or Jonathan who want to answer. So how do we enhance awareness in public health about those power imbalances and actions on those? Matthew?
Yeah, it is a wonderful question. I think it is perhaps one of the biggest areas for improvement. And I would forgive the legal lens, but I would think about it as an issue of fairness or procedural fairness. I think we have to take seriously the idea that if you don't have a diversity of perspectives and participants, particularly with the folks who are most marginalized, if they are absent, whatever comes out is going to be not nearly as useful, productive, as equitable, and so on. And it happens again and again. So advisory committees are struck all the time by government in the pharmaceutical field, other kinds of decisions that regulators make. Often there are an effort to have patient groups, but it's patient groups who self-fund to get there, which are patient groups which are aligned with particular interests. And even though they have an interest in getting a therapy at the end of the day, they may not want to ask questions about how affordable that therapy will be. And in my time in government, I haven't seen a lot of improvement. There's not a line item for improving the diversity of participants in the decision-making process. It's the exception, not the rule, especially when you're talking about everyday processes. Yes, maybe a royal commission will go across the country and make real efforts to be more inclusive in who it seeks to consult with, or how broadly it understands the idea of a stakeholder. But a ton of work happens and is shaped by the people who have the resources to show up and go to Ottawa. And that's a huge problem. There's a lovely book about how this has happened at the grassroots level. I really like Jonathan's point about sort of flipping the question. I went to a critical space when I thought about power, and Jonathan's talking about how to sort of distribute power, redistribute power, and I love that. But what's happened with patient groups, they used to be very grassroots oriented. There's a book called, I'm blanking on the name, Advocacy Inc. or something like that. It's about how patient groups have changed over time. And it's really about the state not supporting a diversity of participants in a policymaking or decision-making process. So I think that's where you've got to think about the individual participants in those meetings, but the larger structures that only allow some individuals to be there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that answer. And Smita, there's a question in here, and I'm going to direct it to you. But what's the agenda? Behind community engagement, community collaboration? We hear a lot about that today. Is there agenda that's given by those in sort of power positions, upper management? And if it is to be driven by the community, how do we go about doing that? And I think you've said a bit to that, but maybe you could tell us a story about how you do that at the Bridge.
Mhm. Yeah, no, thank you, Matthew, for bringing up the procedures. I think it's a policies and procedures, both the things matter. And unless until people in public health realize the policies has to change first in order to procedure to happen. Just give simple examples, right? We said we include people and partner with people, but we pay people in real money for every participation in every meeting and every study related, project related activity. And to make that happen, we had to break a lot of rules. We had to twist a lot of wrists. I can't even begin to tell you how many. Because in our research world, oh, we don't give money, we give vouchers. Oh, you give gift card? No. People told us time and time again, they go with a gift card and the person looks at them as though they stole it from somewhere. So we had decided very early on that we will pay actual money to the participants and the community peer researchers. But we had to change a lot of procedures and policies and create our own policies and talk to the higher uppers in the ethics board and also in our research organization to make that happen. When we get invited, suppose with the Health Canada or our Department of Medicine or internally, externally, and we put our foot down, yes, I will come, but I never speak alone. We always co-present and our community people will be there as my co-speakers and experts. However, they do get honoraria of $60 or whatever we decided internally. And they say, oh, we do not have policy for that. And we say, okay, then if you do not have policy, please create one. And putting food down and creating those policies and procedures is very important. Like, this is simple example I'm giving you. People are donating their time, their expertise, but they are not compensated the way they should be compensated, because we do not have policies of giving money to somebody in the government procedural book. And these are just simple example, but transportation, food, money, and unless until we advocate for those and make space for those, Matthew, you will not be able to bring the delegation that you want to from Halifax to Ottawa, because those are the people need to come whose food you need to take care of and whose transportation you need to take care of. Otherwise, we have not included the voices that really should be included. And that power to people, unless we give, that procedural change, unless we make, that policy, unless we bring, if it's not there, we are talking the, same old.
Thanks, Meena. I've been in government and tried to, as you said, change those policies. So we're going to move to, in just a few minutes, to our small group. We hope that folks will stay with us, and we'll be there in small groups for about 20 minutes, and we can talk about what you've heard here today, what you're thinking about, and then we'll come back into plenary. But Jonathan, I want to give one more question to you, and this is from Greg. And he's talking about our conception and our definition, and I'm going to add, and our values that inform our leadership, how we choose leaders, how we maintain them in power. And I wondered, if, just as we go into our small groups, Jonathan, if you just want to speak a little bit about how we could change that balance, or change that on the way forward. That's a big question, though.
It's a really good question. So one thought about leadership, a couple of thoughts. One about leadership. There's a definition of leadership by somebody named Marshall Gantz, or somebody who teaches organizing. That leadership is about creating the conditions that enable others to achieve their shared purpose. Right? And I really like that definition. And so it's not about an individual just doing it on his own or her own. It's about creating these conditions so that everybody can basically be a leader and everybody can achieve their purpose. And so that's the way we need people to think, and our elected leaders and all of our other leaders as well, in my mind. And they need to be working from a place of values. They need to be prioritizing relationships, long-term, deep solidarity in relationships. so I think, they have to recognize that, that we're all tied together, that our liberation is tied to the liberation of others. And so in the United States, a lot of the community organizing groups are working on elections. I think that's happening a little bit less in Canada, but a lot of community organizing groups are getting involved in electoral politics so that people from those communities are actually the ones who are being elected and are representing us. And that is actually what's going to lead to some long-term change, assuming that those folks stay accountable to their communities. And that's another role that community organizing groups play. So there's lots to unpack there, but that's definitely very tied to power.
Thanks, Jonathan, for that. So we're going to go into the small groups. And before we do, though, I just really want to say thank you, Matthew Herder, for coming today, for your really thoughtful contributions to our conversation today. We'll look forward to working with you, all of us here collectively, as you embrace that opportunity you have with that applied public health chair. So thank you. Matthew has to go and teach. So we're going to go into small groups. Tia has put the discussion questions. Bye, Matthew. Thanks. Discussion questions in our chat. I think there's lots to think about in what was talked about today. And those that are in the small groups will actually copy these into that small chat box as we move forward. So Tia or Marianne, if you can work your magic, and we'll see you back in about 20 minutes.
Yeah, I heard someone say once that change happens at the speed of trust. And I really like that because I feel like it's true.
Thanks everybody, and welcome back. And thanks, I'm just going to thank our colleague Carolina. Thanks for moderating the conversation. That was, I'm going to say, a wild conversation in our small group. So I'm hoping that you had just as good a conversation. So we have a few minutes left here, around 8 minutes, and just a few kind of closing remarks. And I'm going to ask Smita and then Jonathan just to give us some final words in a minute. What they heard in their breakout rooms, what stood out for them there. And I think also what stood out for them as they contemplate the conversation that we've just had over the last hour and a half. And I did say it would go fast, and in my mind, it went extraordinarily fast. So I really want to thank everybody that's here for their willingness to share, to listen, to connect, and to think about or contemplate, vision, or dream that future with us. As we close off, there's about 34 of you still here. I'd like you to use that chat box to put in one thought, one idea, one word, perhaps, that's just sitting with you as Smita and then Jonathan give us some final remarks. And I'd also really like you to encourage you to continue to talk to each other and chat with each other and find each other if you can do that. And if we can help, let us know how we can help to connect you. So Smita, I'm going to go to you. So in just, in a few minutes there, kind of some final words from you. What did you hear in that breakout room? What stood out for you? What did you hear in the last hour and a half? And you talked about magic. And I think I'm just going to look at my notes here. It was that when we treat humans like humans, magic happens. So you can kind of frame your remarks within that frame. That'd be magic for us. So Smita.
Thank you again for a lovely chat and a panel discussion. We started with the equity, as we knew from that panel way back in the beginning of the pandemic, and we said we want to make equity as a new normal because we always say equity is a political choice. And so is power also a political choice. But when you drill that deeper, Equity or inequity, or power or no power is also individual choice. And that's why the person, at the center of it all, and we got to work from that center, because we all do have that power innate in us, that seed of compassion and that seed of equanimity that we need to germinate and cultivate very conscientiously. Because if you make that conscientious effort of cultivating that in yourself, in each other, then only we will get to that place where we do not talk about the imbalances in the society, but equanimous society, and that magic would surface. And that individual power we need to harness and cultivate. And we have that power within us to cultivate that, but we got to work hard.
Thanks, Smita. Yes, hard work, for sure. Thanks. Jonathan, over to you. Kind of your final words, your final thoughts, what you heard today.
Yeah, there was a wide range of feelings shared in our small group, which I found both interesting and I connected with a lot of it, both frustration and optimism. And this is hard work, and I get both sides of that. One of the things that came up for me as I was thinking about what people were saying in small groups, and then when we came back to the big group, what I heard was something about relationships and moving at the speed of trust. And to me, that's a huge piece of this, is building really trusting relationships, which is long-term work. There was a project that I worked on at Human Impact Partners where we partnered a local health department in a county health department in the United States with a community organizing group that was working in that same county. And the public health department was supposed to support the organizing group in their campaign. Whatever the folks who are facing inequities wanted to do, whether it was housing or farming or whatever the issue was, the role of the public health department was to support them with public health evidence and public health voice. And they use this inside-outside piece of things. One of the things I heard in our small group is that there's a lot of leadership at health departments that isn't willing to do this kind of work. And that's a frustration that people have been trying for forever. And that's part of where this outside game comes in. If we have relationships with organizers, can we ask them, not in an email, but verbally in a small meeting, to come and tell the health department leadership that they need to be doing things differently? Like, can we get them to use their power to shift how the health department even works? There's so many intricacies of this inside-outside piece and these relationships, if we have trusting relationships, that we can take advantage of to really shift things. And so I think that's a big piece of where we need to be, where we need to go.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Bruce is putting in there, we need the courage to speak to the people in our environment. And I'm just in maybe a bit of a cheesy way going to use that as a segue to say, make sure you come back. We have 2 more conversations in this series, and the next one is around courage. And as I listened to you there, Jonathan, I was thinking, but it requires courage. Greg and our group talked about being a community organizer in a public health organization and paddling upstream, right? So, it takes courage, it takes leadership, and it takes, an awful lot of relentless incrementalism and hard work there. So thanks to everybody. You will get an evaluation. There is a link that'll come to you. I think they might be putting the link to the evaluation in the chat box as well, so come by mail. These sessions are recorded. They're edited a little bit, the beginning and the end, and then they're put up on our website. So you could invite someone to watch this with you, or your team, or have a conversation about it. Please reach out to us. We have a generic email address, and we answer it. Please reach out to us, and we hope to see you again at the next 2, June 8th and June 22nd, on courage and on hope. Thank you, Jonathan Heller. Thank you, Smita Pakali, for coming and being with us again today. We really, really appreciate your efforts and the passion and compassion that you brought to our conversation today. So thanks, everybody, and we'll We'll see you soon. Bye. Thanks to all my team too and our staff for all their good help